My name is Daniel Miller, and I recently started working as a nurse at Whitmore Manor, an old, rundown asylum in a small town called Ravenswood, nestled deep in upstate New York. It's the kind of place that feels like it's frozen in time, with its creaky floors, flickering lights, and the scent of antiseptic that never quite leaves the air. The building itself feels wrong, like the walls are holding secrets, heavy with the past. When I first took the job, I didn't pay much attention to the whispers from the other staff members. Every old place has its share of stories, right? But Whitmore Manor had one that no one could ignore. There was a patient, the last patient, Samuel Harper. He disappeared under mysterious circumstances more than a decade ago, and no one ever found out what happened to him. His file? Gone. Any mention of his existence seemed to have been erased from the official records. But the staff who had been around long enough still remembered. They talked about him in hushed tones, like even mentioning his name could stir something dark. It wasn't just the fact that he had disappeared. It was the way he had gone, in the dead of night, without a trace, without a sound, as if he had simply vanished into thin air. At first I brushed it off. It was just another urban legend, something to pass the time during late shifts. But then, as I spent more nights in Whitmore, things started to feel different. At first it was small, almost laughable. I'd walk down the hallways on my rounds, and I could swear the air would turn cold, icy, even though the heating system was old but still functioning. Then I'd hear footsteps behind me, faint at first, like someone was just a few paces back. But when I turned around, the corridor was always empty. Every single time. There was one night in particular that stuck with me. I was alone, doing my usual rounds in the East Wing, where Samuel's room had once been. The atmosphere was thick, like the walls themselves were watching me. That's when I heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper, so soft that at first I thought it was just my mind playing tricks. But it grew louder, clearer. It wasn't the usual creaking or groaning of the old building settling. No, this was something else entirely. It sounded like someone was calling my name. Daniel. My heart stopped. I froze in place, trying to convince myself that it was just the wind, a draft slipping through the cracks in the old windows. But the voice came again, this time more distinct. There was no mistaking it. It was coming from down the hall, near the room where Samuel Harper had last been seen. The air felt thick with dread as I stood there, my feet seemingly glued to the floor. Every instinct told me to leave, to get out of that wing, but something, curiosity, or maybe a darker pull, kept me there. I knew then that there was more to this place than the stories, more than the whispers of the staff. Whitmore Manor wasn't just haunted by its past. It was alive with it, and Samuel Harper, wherever he had gone, hadn't left. Not really. The next day, still shaken from the eerie experience in the East Wing, I tried to keep my head down and focus on my duties. I didn't want to seem like the new guy who was easily spooked by ghost stories. But no matter how hard I tried to shake it off, the thought of that whisper, my name echoing down the hallway, stayed with me. It clung to me like a shadow. That night, I decided to look into Samuel Harper's disappearance. If there was even a chance it was connected to what I had experienced, I needed to know more. After my shift, I made my way to the administration office, hoping to find something, anything about him. The office itself was a time capsule. Old filing cabinets with yellowed papers, dust settling in the corners, and the constant hum of fluorescent lights that flickered intermittently. I figured the files on Samuel would be buried deep in some forgotten drawer. After all, no one had talked about him openly in years. I spent hours sifting through paperwork, old patient records, doctor notes, and employee logs, but there was no trace of Samuel Harper. Nothing. It was like he had never existed. Frustrated and ready to give up, I noticed a small, leather-bound journal tucked behind one of the shelves. The cover was worn, its edges frayed, and when I opened it, the name Robert Thompson was scribbled inside the front cover. Thompson had been a nurse here years ago, and from the looks of it, this was his personal journal. What I read inside, I still can't fully explain how it made me feel. The entries were unsettling, to say the least. Robert had written in vivid detail about Samuel Harper. According to his journal, Samuel wasn't just a regular patient. He was different, almost like he knew things that no one else could comprehend. Thompson described how Samuel often sat by the window of his room, staring out into the distance as if waiting for something or someone. He'd talk to himself, but not in the usual way patients do when they're confused or delusional. No, Samuel seemed to be talking to someone or something that wasn't there. In one entry, Thompson wrote about a night when Samuel told him, "They're coming for me. Not from this world, but from the one that waits beyond." That line sent a shiver down my spine. What did he mean by that? Was it just the ramblings of a disturbed man, or was there something more to his words? Thompson seemed to believe it wasn't just madness. He became obsessed with Samuel, writing pages and pages about his odd behavior, about how the air in Samuel's room always felt colder than the rest of the asylum, and how lights would flicker whenever Samuel was upset. But it was the final few entries that truly unsettled me. Robert Thompson began to believe that Samuel Harper wasn't afraid of whatever was coming for him. In fact, it seemed like Samuel was expecting it, almost welcoming it. The last entry was the most chilling. It was dated the night Samuel disappeared. Thompson wrote, "Tonight, it's different. Samuel is calm, unnervingly so. He looked at me and said, 'You'll understand soon. When they come for me, you'll know.' I don't know what he means, but there's something about his eyes tonight. Something that tells me he's leaving, but not by any normal means." That was it. No more entries. Nothing about what happened after that night. I sat there for what felt like hours, just staring at the last page, my heart racing. It was like Robert had known something terrible was about to happen, but he didn't live to write about it. I closed the journal and felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. Suddenly, the building didn't feel like just an old asylum anymore. It felt like a trap, a place where something or someone had been waiting for years, hidden in plain sight. And whatever had taken Samuel Harper, it wasn't done. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about Robert Thompson's journal and Samuel Harper's eerie final words. "When they come for me, you'll know." What did that mean? The idea that Samuel had somehow predicted his own disappearance, that he had been waiting for something otherworldly, sent a chill down my spine. But I couldn't let it go. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that I had to see his room for myself. It was like a knot in my mind that I needed to untangle. I waited until the building was quiet, long after the last of the night staff had settled into their usual routines. The asylum always had a strange stillness about it during the late hours. It wasn't the kind of silence that brought peace. It was thick, oppressive, like the building was holding its breath. I made my way through the dimly lit corridors to the east wing, the place where Samuel's room had once been. It had been closed off for years, left to decay, untouched since the night he vanished. As I reached the hallway leading to his room, the air grew colder, just like Thompson had described in his journal. I could feel it, almost as if the temperature had dropped several degrees the moment I stepped into that wing. My breath formed clouds in front of me, and I shivered, despite my heavy jacket. The lights above flickered as I walked down the long corridor, casting eerie shadows that danced along the cracked walls. It felt like the shadows themselves were alive, shifting and stretching in ways that defied the flickering lights. My footsteps echoed unnervingly, as though the walls were too close, amplifying the sound in unnatural ways. I stopped in front of the door with a faded brass plaque that read Room 202, Samuel Harper. The door was slightly ajar, just enough for me to see the darkness inside. A cold breeze seemed to leak from the room, brushing against my face, and for a moment, I hesitated. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to forget this ridiculous search for answers. But something pulled me forward, a sense that I was about to discover something far worse than a simple missing person case. I pushed the door open, the old hinges creaking loudly in protest. The room inside was exactly what you'd expect from a space that had been abandoned for years. Dust covered every surface, and the air was thick with the stale scent of mildew and neglect. The bed, still neatly made, looked as if it hadn't been touched since Samuel's last night here. There was an unsettling stillness about the room, like it had been frozen in time. But then something caught my eye. In the corner near the window, there was an old wooden rocking chair. It stood out because it was the only thing in the room that wasn't covered in dust. It looked polished, almost brand new, As I stepped closer, I noticed that the chair was rocking slowly back and forth on its own. There was no draft, no wind, nothing that could have caused it to move. I stood there, frozen, watching as the chair continued its ghostly motion, the rhythmic creaking filling the otherwise silent room. My pulse quickened as I tried to rationalize what I was seeing. But deep down, I knew this wasn't something I could explain away. Suddenly, the window rattled violently, as if something was banging against it from the outside. I jumped, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound was deafening, but when I looked outside, there was nothing, just the dark, empty grounds of the asylum stretching out into the night. I turned back to the room, my eyes drawn to the rocking chair, which had stopped moving completely. The silence that followed was suffocating. That's when I heard it, a whisper, barely audible, but unmistakable. "Daniel, my name," just like before. Only this time, it wasn't coming from the hallway. It was coming from inside the room, from right behind me. I spun around, expecting to see someone standing there, but the room was empty. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as the cold intensified. The whisper came again, closer this time, and I could feel a presence, something unseen, standing just behind me. I wanted to leave, to run as far away from that room as possible, but my legs felt like lead. It was as if the room itself didn't want to let me go, like something was keeping me there. The whisper grew louder, almost urgent, repeating my name over and over. "Daniel, Daniel." It was everywhere, surrounding me, pressing against my mind. I stumbled backward, crashing into the doorframe, my breath coming in ragged gasps. As I reached for the door to pull myself out of the room, I caught one final glimpse of the rocking chair. It was moving again, this time faster, almost violently, and in the dim light, I could see something or someone sitting in it. A shadowy figure, indistinct but unmistakably there, watching me. Without thinking, I bolted from the room, slamming the door shut behind me. My heart pounded in my ears as I raced down the hallway, not daring to look back. I didn't stop running until I reached the other end of the building, my lungs burning and my mind racing. Whatever had happened in that room, whatever I had seen, it wasn't over. I could feel it in my bones. The presence of Samuel Harper hadn't left Whitmore Manor, and now it knew I was looking for it. For days after my encounter in Samuel Harper's room, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. It didn't matter where I was, whether I was doing rounds in the common areas or walking through the halls at night. I always felt a presence, a cold pressure at the back of my neck. It was subtle at first, like a weight you can't quite pinpoint, but soon it became more intense, more invasive. I wasn't just imagining things. I knew something was there. The other staff didn't seem to notice anything unusual. They went about their business like everything was normal, oblivious to the suffocating atmosphere that was slowly creeping over me. I tried to talk myself down, telling myself that I was overreacting, that this was just the result of too many nights spent reading old journals and scaring myself with ghost stories. But deep down, I knew better. I had seen the rocking chair move. I had heard the whispers, and I had felt the cold presence of someone or something still lingering in that room. A few nights later, I found myself on the late shift again. The halls of Whitmore Manor were eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that makes your skin prickle. I was making my rounds in the East Wing, avoiding room 202 like the plague, when I heard a soft thud from down the hall. My first thought was that one of the patients had gotten out of bed or knocked something over, so I headed toward the sound, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. As I approached the source of the noise, I noticed something strange. The lights in the hallway began to flicker. Not just the typical old building flicker, but in a deliberate pattern, almost rhythmic. They would flash on and off in sync with my footsteps, creating a strobe-like effect that made the shadows on the walls seem to lurch and twist unnaturally. My heart began to race as the thudding sound grew louder, more insistent, like something was banging against the walls just ahead. I reached the end of the hallway and found myself standing outside one of the old storage rooms. The door was slightly ajar, and the thudding was coming from inside. I hesitated, a wave of dread washing over me. Part of me wanted to turn around, to pretend I hadn't heard anything and leave that door closed forever. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this was connected to Samuel Harper, that this was another piece of the puzzle I couldn't ignore. With trembling hands, I pushed the door open. The room beyond was dark, lit only by the weak beam of my flashlight. Old medical equipment was stacked haphazardly against the walls. Rusty gurneys, cracked bedpans, and dusty cabinets filled with forgotten supplies. But that wasn't what caught my attention. In the center of the room, there was an old hospital bed, and on top of it, something was moving. At first, I thought it was just a sheet, maybe stirred by a draft or the settling of the building. But as I stepped closer, I realized it wasn't just the sheet moving. Something underneath it was rising and falling, as if a person was lying there, breathing. My flashlight flickered as I approached the bed, my pulse pounding in my ears. I stopped just short of it, my breath catching in my throat. Slowly, almost reluctantly, I reached out and pulled the sheet back. What I saw made my blood run cold. There was no one there. The bed was empty, but the indentations in the mattress told a different story. There had been someone or something lying there moments before I entered. The shape of a body was still clearly visible in the fabric, like a shadow left behind after something had vanished. And then, just as I started to back away, I saw it, the faint outline of a handprint pressed into the pillow. It was fresh, as if someone had just lifted their head. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. The room felt colder now, unbearably cold, and the air around me grew thick and oppressive, like the walls were closing in. As I turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of movement in the corner of my eye. I whipped my head around, shining the flashlight toward the far wall, and for a split second, I saw something, a figure standing in the shadows, just beyond the reach of the light. It was tall and gaunt, with indistinct features, almost like it was made of smoke or mist. But the eyes were bright, glowing with a pale, unnatural light. They were fixed on me, watching, waiting. Before I could react, the figure disappeared, dissolving into the darkness like it had never been there. My legs felt like jelly as I scrambled out of the room, slamming the door behind me. My breath came in ragged gasps, and I leaned against the wall, trying to steady myself. The pounding in my head was deafening, and my hands were shaking uncontrollably. I didn't know what I had just seen, but I knew one thing for certain: whatever had been in that room was not human. As I made my way back to the main wing, I couldn't stop replaying the image of those glowing eyes in my mind. They weren't just watching me. They were searching for something or someone, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was somehow part of whatever was happening, that I had been drawn into something far bigger and far more dangerous than I could understand. That night, I lay awake in my bed, my mind racing. I knew I couldn't go back to work without figuring out what was going on. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that this wasn't just about Samuel Harper anymore. There was something darker at play, something that had been lurking in the shadows of Whitmore Manor for years. And now, it had taken notice of me. I didn't sleep at all that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those glowing eyes staring back at me. And I knew, whatever had taken Samuel Harper hadn't left Whitmore Manor. And it wasn't going to leave me alone, either. The next day, I went into work exhausted. I hadn't slept a wink, haunted by the visions of glowing eyes and the strange, oppressive feeling that had gripped me the night before. The halls of Whitmore Manor felt different in the daylight, though. The cold presence that had followed me in the night was absent, and everything seemed almost normal. Almost. I kept telling myself that maybe it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, that the stress of being new to the job, combined with the unsettling stories I'd been reading, had pushed me to see things that weren't really there. But deep down, I knew better. Whatever I had experienced the night before wasn't just a figment of my tired mind. It was real, and the worst part was I felt like I was the only one who knew. Everyone else, my co-workers, the patients, even the janitorial staff, they all moved around the asylum as if nothing strange had ever happened there. It was as if they were blind to the darkness that lingered in the corners of the building. I was trying to keep myself busy, focusing on menial tasks, sorting paperwork, checking on patients, doing anything to distract myself, when I noticed something odd. In the nurse's station, There was an old bulletin board that had been used to post announcements and schedules. It hadn't been updated in years, the paper yellowed with age and the thumbtacks rusted. But pinned to the board, half hidden behind some old memos, was a faded photograph that caught my eye. It was a black and white picture, taken decades ago, of a group of nurses and orderlies standing outside Whitmore Manor. They were smiling, arms around each other's shoulders, clearly proud of the work they were doing. But one face in the picture stood out to me. In the far back, almost obscured by the others, was a tall man with sharp features and hollow eyes. He wasn't smiling like the rest. His expression was blank, detached, as if he wasn't really part of the group at all. There was something familiar about him, something that sent a shiver down my spine. I pulled the photo from the board, staring at the man's face. I was sure I had seen him before, but I couldn't quite place where. Then it hit me, the figure I had seen in the storage room the night before. The shape in the shadows with the glowing eyes. The resemblance was too close to ignore. Was it possible that the man in the photo was somehow connected to the figure in the room? The idea seemed ridiculous, but after everything I had experienced, I wasn't about to dismiss anything. I flipped the photo over, hoping for some clue as to who the man was. Written on the back, in faded ink, were the names of everyone in the picture. I scanned the list, my finger stopping when I reached a name near the bottom. Samuel Harper. My breath caught in my throat. The man in the picture, the one who had looked so out of place, was Samuel Harper, the last patient to disappear from Whitmore Manor. But that didn't make sense. This was supposed to be a picture of the staff, not the patients. What was he doing there? And why did he look so different from the way Robert Thompson had described him in his journal? The Samuel Harper I'd read about was frail, sick, barely able to walk by the end of his stay at the asylum. But the man in the photo was tall, strong, with an intensity in his eyes that unnerved me. The more I stared at the photograph, the more I felt like something was wrong, like there was a secret hidden in plain sight. I took the photo with me, determined to dig deeper. I had to find out who Samuel Harper really was and what had happened to him in the days leading up to his disappearance. Maybe then I could make sense of the strange events that were now unfolding around me. I started by heading down to the archives in the basement. It was a part of the asylum that no one really went to anymore, a damp, dusty room filled with old records, some dating back to when Whitmore Manor first opened its doors. As I sifted through the boxes of patient files, I found Samuel Harper's file buried beneath decades of forgotten paperwork. The folder was thick, filled with handwritten notes from doctors and nurses over the years. As I finished reading, the basement lights flickered, casting long, twisted shadows on the walls. My heart raced as I heard a faint sound, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like someone drumming their fingers against wood. It was coming from the far corner of the room, where the old wooden filing cabinet stood. I slowly approached, my breath catching in my throat. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. I reached the cabinet and, with trembling hands, pulled open one of the drawers. Inside, there was nothing but dust and old files. But as I closed the drawer, the tapping stopped abruptly, and I felt a sudden, cold gust of air brush past me, like something had just moved through the room. I spun around, but I was alone, or at least I thought I was. The air was thick with the sense that I was being watched. My skin crawled as I realized that the presence I had felt the night before had followed me here. It was as if Samuel Harper, or whatever was left of him, was trying to tell me something important. I grabbed the files and raced back upstairs, my mind reeling. Samuel Harper's disappearance wasn't just a mystery. It was part of something much bigger. And I was starting to believe that whatever had taken him was still here, lurking in the shadows of Whitmore Manor, watching, waiting. And now I feared it was coming for me too. By the time I reached the upper floors, my heart was pounding, and my hands trembled with the weight of the files I had grabbed. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something. Someone following me, but there was nothing. The halls were still and silent, but they didn't feel safe. The oppressive air I'd sensed in the basement seemed to have followed me, clinging to my every step, growing heavier as I moved through the asylum. I returned to the nurse's station and dropped the files on the counter, my breath coming in short gasps. I tried to steady myself, telling myself that I had just been spooked. But as I caught my reflection in a nearby window, I realized how pale and haggard I looked. My eyes were wide with fear, my skin ghostly under the harsh fluorescent lights. I hardly recognized myself. I forced myself to sit down and focus on the files. I needed answers, something that could explain Samuel Harper's disappearance and the eerie events I'd been experiencing. But as I started flipping through the records again, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The final page of Samuel Harper's file was missing. I was sure it had been there when I first read it, detailing the night of his disappearance, but now it was gone. The file ended abruptly with a doctor's note about his declining mental state. No mention of the events that followed. Frustrated, I rifled through the rest of the papers, but it was no use. The page wasn't there. Someone or something had removed it. I sat back, feeling a wave of dread wash over me. It was as if the asylum itself was trying to keep the truth hidden, erasing any trace of what had really happened to Samuel Harper. That's when I noticed something else, a faint whisper. At first, I thought it was the wind, or perhaps one of the other nurses passing by, but when I looked around, the hall was completely empty. The whisper grew louder, more insistent, like a voice calling my name from far away. It seemed to echo down the hallway, pulling me toward it. Despite every instinct telling me to stay put, I found myself getting up and walking toward the sound. The whisper was barely audible, but it had a strange, magnetic pull. My feet moved of their own accord, carrying me down the long, dim corridor that led to the older part of the building, the section that had been closed off for years. As I approached the heavy, rusted doors that led to the old wing, the whisper stopped abruptly. Silence enveloped me, thick and suffocating. I reached for the door handle, half expecting it to be locked, but to my surprise, it swung open with a loud creak, revealing the darkened hallway beyond. I hesitated for a moment, my mind racing. I knew I shouldn't go in there. I'd heard stories about the old wing, the part of Whitmore Manor where the most dangerous and unstable patients had been housed before it was shut down. No one had set foot in that section for years. The air inside was thick with decay, the smell of mildew and dust hanging heavy in the air. But something was pulling me in. I stepped over the threshold, the darkness closing in around me like a shroud. My flashlight flickered weakly, casting long, shifting shadows along the cracked walls. The corridor stretched out before me, seemingly endless, with doors on either side leading into the old patient rooms. Each door was labeled with a number, though the paint had long since chipped away, leaving them barely legible. As I walked deeper into the old wing, the oppressive feeling returned, stronger than ever. It felt as though I was being watched, though I couldn't see anyone. My skin prickled with unease, and every step I took felt heavier, as if I were wading through some invisible force that didn't want me there. I passed by several rooms, my flashlight illuminating the dust-covered floors and peeling wallpaper, but something made me stop in front of room 13. The door was slightly ajar, a crack of darkness beckoning me inside. My breath caught in my throat as I pushed the door open with a trembling hand. The room was small and sparsely furnished, just an old iron-framed bed and a single chair in the corner. The window was barred, the glass dirty and smeared with grime. But what drew my attention was the figure standing by the bed. It was the same man I'd seen in the photograph, Samuel Harper. Or at least, it looked like him. He was facing away from me, his shoulders hunched, his head tilted as though he were listening to something. The air around him seemed to shimmer, distorting the space he occupied, like a heat wave bending the light. My mouth went dry, my heart hammering in my chest. I wanted to turn and run, but my feet were frozen in place. "Samuel," I whispered, my voice barely audible. The figure didn't move. For a long moment, the silence was deafening, pressing in from all sides. Then, slowly, he turned to face me. His eyes, those same hollow, glowing eyes I'd seen in the storage room, locked onto mine, and I felt an overwhelming wave of terror wash over me. His face was gaunt, pale, like a corpse pulled from the ground after years of decay. But there was something else, something unnatural about the way he looked, as if he didn't belong in this world anymore. I stumbled back, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My mind was screaming at me to get out, to run as fast as I could, but I couldn't tear my gaze away from him. He took a step toward me, his movements slow and deliberate, and I felt the air grow colder with each inch he moved. "You shouldn't have come here," he rasped, his voice a low, guttural whisper that seemed to echo inside my head. Before I could respond, the door slammed shut behind me, trapping me in the room with him. The walls seemed to close in, the darkness suffocating, and I realized with a sickening certainty that I wasn't going to make it out of there. I was standing face to face with the last patient of Whitmore Manor, and whatever had happened to him, whatever had taken him, was now reaching for me. And there was no one left to save me. The air in the room became impossibly cold, like I had stepped into a walk-in freezer, and every breath felt sharp, painful, as though the air itself had turned to ice. Samuel Harper, or whatever was left of him, stood motionless by the bed, his hollow eyes fixed on me. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might tear through my chest, and every muscle in my body screamed for me to run. But I couldn't. My legs were glued to the floor, my entire body paralyzed with fear. The silence that hung between us felt oppressive, heavy. It was like the world outside had ceased to exist. All that was left was the dark, decaying room and the nightmare that stood before me. My flashlight flickered once, then went out completely, plunging the room into pitch-black darkness. I was alone with him. "Why are you here?" Samuel's voice echoed through the room, low and distorted, like a broken radio signal cutting in and out. His mouth barely moved, but the words filled the space around me, penetrating my thoughts. It wasn't just his voice I heard. It was like his presence was inside my mind, probing, searching for something. I tried to speak, but no sound came out. I couldn't even form a coherent thought. The terror was too overwhelming. My throat felt like it was closing up, as if the very air in the room had become thick, suffocating. The darkness pressed in from all sides, and I could feel something, an invisible force, moving closer, circling me. "I didn't disappear," Samuel rasped, his voice sending a chill down my spine. "I was taken." Taken? By what? My thoughts scrambled to make sense of his words, but nothing seemed real anymore. The room felt like it was shifting, warping, the walls stretching and contracting as if they were alive. I glanced around, my eyes struggling to adjust to the darkness, and that's when I saw them, shadows moving along the walls, sliding toward me. They weren't normal shadows. They had substance, form like they were crawling out from the cracks in the walls themselves. Fear surged through me, stronger than I had ever felt before. It was primal, uncontrollable, the kind of fear that makes you forget who you are. My instincts took over, and I lunged for the door, desperate to escape. My hand fumbled for the handle, but it wouldn't budge. It felt like something on the other side was holding it closed, trapping me inside. I could feel Samuel's presence behind me, closing in, the coldness of him seeping into my bones. His voice slithered through the room like a snake. "They come for us all, in the end." I turned to face him, my back pressed against the door, my chest rising and falling in panicked gasps. He was standing mere feet away now, and I could see the twisted, hollow expression on his face, like a man caught between life and death. His skin was stretched tight over his bones, his eyes glowing faintly in the dark, as if some force deep within him was keeping him tethered to this world. "I didn't want to go," he whispered, his voice filled with an eerie sadness. "But once you see them, you can't escape." My mind was racing, trying to comprehend what he was saying, but before I could process it, the shadows on the walls began to take shape. They twisted and stretched into long, skeletal forms, their limbs too long, their movements unnatural. They crawled toward me, their eyes glowing the same pale light as Samuel's. I could feel their hunger, their need to consume. In a desperate attempt to break free, I grabbed the chair from the corner of the room and hurled it at the door. The loud crash reverberated through the room, but the door didn't budge. My heart sank. I was trapped in this room with Samuel and these things. The shadows reached the bed, their elongated fingers wrapping around the iron frame, their forms shifting and writhing. They began to pull at Samuel, their long limbs coiling around him like vines. He didn't resist. He just stood there, staring at me with those vacant, glowing eyes. "They'll come for you too," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Once you've seen them, it's only a matter of time." I backed into the door, my body trembling uncontrollably. The shadows were pulling him apart, his form dissolving into darkness, and yet his gaze remained locked on mine, as if he were warning me, pleading with me to understand. But I didn't understand. I couldn't. All I knew was that I had to get out. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the room fell silent. The shadows vanished, and Samuel was gone. The oppressive cold lifted, and I was left alone in the dark, my breath coming in shallow, ragged bursts. For a moment, I thought I might be free, that whatever had happened was over. But then, the door creaked open behind me, slowly, as if inviting me to leave. I didn't hesitate. I bolted out of the room and down the hallway, not caring where I was going, just needing to get as far away from that place as possible. The hallways stretched out before me, twisting and turning, but I didn't stop. I didn't look back. By the time I reached the stairwell, my legs were burning and my lungs felt like they were on fire. But I didn't care. I stumbled down the stairs, my hand gripping the railing so tightly my knuckles turned white. When I finally burst through the front doors of the asylum and into the night air, I collapsed onto the cold pavement, gasping for breath. I had escaped, but even as I sat there, trembling and soaked in sweat, I knew deep down that it wasn't over. Samuel's final words echoed in my mind, chilling me to the core. "Once you've seen them, you can't escape." And I had seen them. I thought it was over when I stepped out of that building, when the cold night air hit my face, and the asylum loomed behind me like some terrible memory I could lock away. But deep down, I knew Samuel was right. You don't just walk away from something like that. The drive back to my apartment was a blur. I don't even remember starting the engine or navigating the dark roads. My hands were shaking so badly on the wheel that I thought I might veer off into a ditch. All I could think about was Samuel's hollow eyes and the way the shadows twisted and contorted around him, and that terrible, inevitable feeling that they were coming for me too. When I got home, I locked every door and window like that would somehow keep whatever I'd seen at bay. I even checked the closets, under the bed, every dark corner where those things could hide. It was ridiculous, like a child afraid of monsters. But then again, I wasn't entirely sure they weren't monsters. My heart hadn't stopped racing since I'd left the asylum. I tried telling myself it was just my imagination, that maybe I had misunderstood what I'd seen, but it was no use. I knew better. The shadows had felt real, too real. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Samuel's face staring at me, his voice echoing in my head. "Once you see them, you can't escape." And then the nightmares began. I don't even know when I fell asleep. One minute, I was lying there, staring at the ceiling, and the next I was back in that dark hallway of the asylum, the one that seemed to stretch on forever. But this time, it wasn't a dream. It felt too vivid, too cold. My breath hung in the air like mist, and I could hear the faint echo of footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate. I turned around, and there they were, the shadows. Just like before, they weren't just tricks of the light. They were moving, shifting, crawling across the walls like living things. I felt the same overwhelming terror rise up in my chest, the same bone-deep dread that had frozen me back in Samuel's room. They were coming closer, stretching their long, skeletal limbs toward me, their eyeless faces locked on mine. I ran. I bolted down the hallway, my feet slapping against the cold floor as I tried to put as much distance between me and those things as possible. But no matter how fast I ran, the hallway never ended. It just kept going, stretching further and further into darkness. The shadows were right behind me, their icy breath on the back of my neck. I could feel their fingers brushing against my skin, cold and clammy like they were trying to pull me into the walls. I was screaming, my voice echoing off the walls, but there was no one to hear me. No one but them. Suddenly, I was back in Samuel's room. The bed was empty, the sheets still stained with years of decay, but the room felt different now, more alive, more suffocating. The shadows were everywhere, creeping along the ceiling, slipping through the cracks in the walls and wrapping around my legs like chains. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I was trapped. And then I heard his voice again. They come for us all, in the end. I turned, and there he was, Samuel, standing in the corner, just like before. Only now, he looked worse, decayed, more skeletal, like the life had been completely drained from him. His eyes were nothing but black voids, and his mouth stretched into a twisted smile. He was no longer human. "They'll take you too," he whispered, his voice blending with the shadows around him. "It's already begun." I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding in my chest like I had just run a marathon. The sun was just starting to rise, casting an eerie glow through the blinds. I stumbled out of bed, my legs still shaky, and splashed cold water on my face, trying to shake the lingering fear. But as I looked at my reflection in the mirror, I froze. Behind me, in the corner of the bathroom, was a shadow. Not mine, not from the light. It was there, solid and dark, shifting just like the ones in the asylum. I turned around quickly, but it was gone. I stood there for a long moment, my breath coming in short, panicked bursts. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I had just seen, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized what Samuel had meant. Once you see them, they never leave. For the next few days, the shadows followed me everywhere. I saw them in the corner of my vision, sliding across the walls of my apartment, lurking behind streetlights, even stretching across the floor of my office. Every time I tried to confront them, they would vanish, leaving me feeling like I was losing my mind. I stopped sleeping altogether, terrified that if I closed my eyes, they'd come for me like they had for Samuel. Every noise, every flicker of light felt like a sign that they were getting closer. The walls of my apartment seemed to close in on me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, followed. I tried to go back to the asylum, to confront whatever had happened there, but when I arrived, it was as though the place had changed. The building looked the same, but the door I had entered through was locked. No one answered when I knocked. It was like the place had sealed itself off from the world, as if it didn't want me to return. That night, I sat alone in my apartment, every light in the house turned on, hoping it would keep the shadows away. But deep down, I knew it was useless. I couldn't run from them forever. They were coming for me. And now, as I sit here writing this, I can feel the cold creeping in again. The same cold that filled Samuel's room. My breath is misting in front of me, and the shadows are growing longer on the walls. I can hear something moving behind me, just outside my field of vision, but I won't turn around. I won't give them the satisfaction, because I know, just like Samuel said, once you see them, there's no escape.